My name is Hilda. I'm from Honduras, from the city of Tegucigalpa, and what I'm about to tell you happened over several years, specifically from 2007 to 2009, and it was one of the most horrific experiences my family and I have ever endured. It all revolves around a woman who, by a twist of fate, decided to make my younger brother, Vicente, the object of her unhealthy obsession. My family and I have always lived in a community on the outskirts of Tegucigalpa, in a small but cozy house. We knew all our neighbors, since it's a small area, except for one who had moved in relatively recently, a woman of about 35 years old whom I'll call Judith. This woman was quite different from the rest, not because of her appearance, but because of her personality. Silent, reserved, and very rude. She wouldn't greet anyone, made strange and annoying noises at night, and often left large bags of garbage in front of her house, even if the garbage truck wasn't due for days. Rumors spread among the people in the community that she was a witch, and although I didn't want to pay much attention to other people's gossip, the truth is that I began to feel a little suspicious of her. A few months after moving to our community, my brother Vicente turned 17. He was quite handsome, dark-haired, tall, and muscular, so, as was normal, many girls were attracted to him. However, there was someone else besides a few teenagers who had her eyes on Vicente, Judith. She was always watching him from her balcony, and I started noticing it in the afternoons, since he used to meet me at the court at the foot of the hill when I got home from work, and we'd walk up together around 6 or 7 at night. He didn't seem to notice this strange observer, or rather, he didn't care at all, but I did, and it didn't sit well with me. When Vicente walked past with me, she would stare at him, and that bothered me, since I had her figured out. Her heavy, angry gaze changed with him, and I found it offensive that a woman almost 20 years older than my brother was falling in love with him. I told my mother about it, but she didn't do anything about it, and I actually felt quite silly thinking she was jealous that someone was interested in my brother, however twisted that was, since he was still a minor. I asked Vicente what he thought about it, and he made fun of the situation, downplaying it. He didn't care about Judith, and in fact, he hadn't even thought about her until I brought it up. That made I calm down and stop paying attention to the situation, innocently assuming that nothing else would happen. Obviously, I didn't know what Judith was capable of. Everything changed one night in May, a year later, a few months after Vicente's birthday. The tradition we had was broken, as he hadn't waited for me at the basketball court. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it and started walking up the road to our house. I was very surprised, and my breath almost caught in my throat when I saw him talking to Judith from the street, and she was smiling at him from the balcony. I went over immediately. He turned to greet me, and she looked at me too, in a terrible, threatening way. She went from joy to rage for a moment before smiling again, as if she didn't want Vicente to realize how fake and hypocritical she really was. She was undoubtedly an unpleasant woman, but Vicente said goodbye to her as if nothing had happened. When I asked him what they had talked about, he wasn't very specific and pretended the topic was unimportant, even though it certainly was. From that night on, instead of waiting for me at the court, he waited for me in front of Judith's house, and then he stopped walking me to stay and talk to her for hours. Little by little, he distanced himself from our mother and then from me. We were best friends, and suddenly, he didn't want to talk to me anymore. I also noticed changes in his appearance and behavior. He went from being an athletic boy who played basketball every afternoon and went jogging in the mornings to being sedentary and eating poorly. He stopped reading, and his sharp sense of humor was replaced by a constant bad mood that neither my mother nor I could explain. Any attempt to talk to him was immediately rejected. It was frustrating, but the only time I saw a glimmer of joy in his old personality was when he was talking to that awful woman, Judith. I was completely infatuated with her, and I mentioned it to my mother again, just as I had a year before. This time, she listened and started asking people in the community about this woman. The truth is, no one knew much about her, except for her neighbor, an older woman who was a friend of my mother's. She explained, almost as a secret, that she had no proof, but she was absolutely certain that this Judith was a witch and that perhaps Vicente was under her spell. My heart raced at the thought, and my hands burned with rage. I'm a very devout Catholic, and anything to do with witchcraft, spells, and such things fills me with a deep revulsion, rejection. I felt a lot of anger and tried to talk to my brother again, but he vehemently denied that Judith was a bad person and insisted that we should stop obsessing over him and let him do whatever he wanted with his life. All this while, I watched him grow pale, thin, and aged, despite being only 18. A whole year passed, and I felt powerless as my brother withered away. He started doing poorly at university, and one night he didn't come home. I grew tired of calling him, but a wise man whom I trusted completely. He listened to me, and I'm eternally grateful for his help, because instead of just telling me to pray, he entrusted me with a couple of items that would turn the situation around: a small bottle of holy water and a consecrated medal that belonged to him. He told me to give the medal to Vicente and return it to him when everything was resolved. He asked me to remain strong in my faith and assured me that everything would be all right soon. I sprinkled holy water at home, but he didn't answer. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw him leaving Judith's house, his clothes changed. She, unlike him, looked rejuvenated and beautiful. As she passed, she gave me a cynical look, a fake smile, as if she were somehow boasting that she had stolen my brother from me. I couldn't let it go. Again, I tried to contact Vicente, but this time I changed my approach. I didn't try to scold him or convince him that that woman was bad for him. Instead, I tried to understand him, and little by little he gradually allowed me to approach him again. He explained that Judith made him feel good, and that unlike other women, he felt she understood him. Part of me thought it was all absurd, since he'd never had any major problems. In fact, Vicente was still quite childish until recently, but obviously I didn't say so. And as the weeks went by, he explained how he felt and allowed me to ask him a question that would change everything. "And brother, what do you think she sees in you? I mean, how do you think it all started?" I have to admit I was afraid to ask her that question because I had made so much progress in getting her to trust me again, and I was afraid that telling her that would make her shut down, but it was quite the opposite. She suddenly stopped to think and answered that she really had no idea. Yes, he was handsome, but that wasn't everything. So why was she so in love with him? The truth is, she didn't know. As for how it all started, it was really simple. One afternoon, around 4, he was walking to the basketball court when she called him over in a very gentle tone. He doesn't know what changed, but at that moment she stopped being just an ordinary neighbor and seemed to him like the most beautiful and charming woman in the world. I went to have coffee with her, and from that day on, everything changed. I had hit the nail on the head, and the theory that this woman had bewitched my brother became stronger and more evident, but we had no idea what we could do. I tried to talk about it with the priest at my church, Celestino, a very thoughtful man. Everything was in Vicente's room, and that same night, I gave him the little medal to wear as a necklace. He accepted it willingly, like when everything was all right, and went to sleep with it. It was late 2008 when Vicente called me at work. Only a couple of weeks had passed, and at first I didn't notice any significant change in my brother's behavior. But when I spoke to him on the phone, he told me, his voice trembling, that Judith was furious with him and that he was terrified. She attacked him and tried to rip off the little medal, but something inside him told him not to let her. Now he was home, scared to death, and Mom still hadn't gotten home from work. I asked my boss to let me leave a little early and went to be with my brother. When I passed by Judith's house, she came out to meet me. He started cursing at me and yelled at me not to interfere or things would get worse for everyone. I couldn't hold back any longer and started yelling at him to stay away from my family and that she had no power over us. That made her furious, and she went back home, although it wouldn't be the last we heard from her. Vicente was at home, quite nervous, and explained to me that for the past few days he had started to see Judith differently. He began to notice the domineering way she treated him. Furthermore, several comments she used to make that he found funny and innocent began to upset him greatly. Comments about my mother and about me, truly hurtful things. He tried to remember everything they had experienced together during that year and how many things he had overlooked almost without reason, things that, in retrospect, bothered him. Besides, he didn't even find her attractive anymore. I asked him if he wanted to see her again, and he insisted he didn't. I felt like I could breathe a sigh of relief, and as the weeks went by, I saw Vicente regain his color and his athletic physique. We tried to pass by Judith's house as quickly as possible, and she would glare at us angrily from the window. It wasn't a single time she didn't. Getting rid of her wouldn't be as simple as ignoring her. And then the problem returned at the beginning of January. My room was next to the kitchen, and one early morning I heard someone hurriedly moving pots and pans and silverware. I went out to get their attention since I needed to sleep, but to my surprise, there was no one in the kitchen. The cabinets were open, pots were scattered on the floor, and both Vicente and my mother were coming out of their rooms. This happened almost every day. I distanced himself from her and hadn't stopped calling and texting him for months. She showed up at the door more than once, refusing to listen to reason and demanding to see Vicente. It was clear that she had decided to attack him as revenge. I went to Father Celestino again. He promised to visit my house, met with my brother, and for the next month came back to visit us once or twice a week, praying and blessing everyone in our home. At first, this upset the entity, but little by little, it lessened its influence, night and in different parts of the house. On another occasion, I was in the living room watching television when the chandelier began to sway gently. I stared out the window, terrified, since it was tightly closed and there was no draft. My mother also felt things, like someone sitting at the foot of her bed, and she swears she saw a shadow reflected in the mirror while she was brushing her teeth. It was terrifying, but undeniably so. The one who suffered the most from these events was Vicente, who he saw shadows out of the corner of his eye. He felt his bed being moved and woke up one morning with 3 scratches on his chest. In mid-February, Vicente became seriously ill. We took him to the doctor, but they couldn't find anything more than the flu and extreme fatigue. I couldn't understand how such a healthy young man could be so sick, so they prescribed rest, fluids, and other things that I knew wouldn't do much good, since this problem had her name written all over it. Judith was furious because my brother was... One afternoon, after one of his visits, Father Celestino paused for a moment. That little old man in his black shirt and tie stood in front of Judith's house, even though I hadn't told him where she lived. He stared at her and waited for her to appear on her balcony. I remember his words clearly. "You who seek to destroy, you will find nothing. You would do yourself a favor believing here, for the one you try to harm has God on his side, and you can do nothing to hurt him." Judith spat and cursed a couple of times, but Father Celestino stood firm, and he assured me again that everything would be all right. He was right, and I only had to wait a couple more months. Little by little, the noises and supernatural events disappeared, and to the surprise and relief of everyone in the community, that woman left the house shortly afterward. Inside, besides a lot of trash and filth, they found an altar with my brother's picture covered in black candles and belongings of his. There were also pictures of my mother and one of me that she had altered, scratched, and torn. Vicente admitted to giving her the pictures, but he had no idea what Judith planned to do with them. It was a terrible 2 years, but it all seemed to be over. Vicente came with me to return the small medal consecrated to Father Celestino, but he told us to keep it and to always have faith, because evil exists, but so does good. When I tried to get answers about why Judith did all that, Father Celestino shrugged, assuring me that it must have been a whim, but that we were far from her evil. Indeed, we never heard from her again, and I hope it stays that way. My name is Eduardo, and I'm a firefighter in the state of Baja California. I'm 30 years old, and although I don't believe in these things, I think this is the right place to share what I saw, or what I think I saw. Maybe someone in the community can tell me what happened, and if there's a logical explanation behind it. I'll change the names of those involved to protect their identities, as they are firefighters just like me. And I wouldn't want the credibility and mental health of any of us to be called into question in any way. As I said, I'm from Baja California, and I work at a relatively large fire station. In the summer, when there's little rain, we're forced to respond to fires more often than usual, especially in remote fields, agricultural areas, and outlying parts of the city, where some troublemakers decide, God knows why, that it's a good time to set fire to trash. Many fires are also started by discarded broken bottles, lit cigarette butts, and other trash that, upon contact with dry grass, ignites almost immediately. One night in mid-June, we were resting in the common room around 9 p.m. when we received a call about a fire on the outskirts of the city. It was the first call of the shift, so we were alert and ready. Rest areas. I mention this in case anyone tries to attribute our sighting to fatigue. At that time, I had known my now best friend on the force for a few months. a young man I'll call Lionel. We ran to the trucks, and as soon as we sat down and left the station, I saw him shudder in the seat across from me. I asked him if he was nervous, and he quickly shook his head before saying something that would define the rest of our day. No, but the night is strange. I scoffed at him, dismissing what he was saying. Unlike me, he'd shown himself to be a very superstitious person from day one. And although I've always respected him, there were also many jokes between us because on more than one occasion, he'd admitted to seeing ghosts and things like that. I assumed he was exaggerating or that he'd simply seen something with a logical explanation, but he preferred to attribute it to something supernatural. The thing is, unlike other nights, this one was indeed strange. As our truck traveled along a road that skirted the city and we caught sight of the flames of the fire in the distance, I noticed how quiet and cold the night was. That's something that can be explained logically, since nights are usually like that, but everyone in the truck felt as if something was off. I looked around carefully, and the first of several strange things I would see that night appeared before my eyes. A woman, dressed in black, whose face I couldn't see because she was walking away into the woods with her back to us. It was a fleeting glimpse, but I think she was wearing a hooded sweater, or perhaps a veil. I'm not sure. By this time, we were getting close to the fire as the heat intensified and the strong smell of smoke assaulted my nostrils. We jumped out of the truck, and Officer Gutierrez, who was basically our boss, carefully assessed the situation. It wasn't a huge fire yet. The fire was spreading to the long path to the bottom of a ravine, in a plot of land covered with low vegetation that, I estimate, measured about 200 meters. Fortunately, it wasn't yet a large forest fire, but the wind was blowing hard that night, and there was a risk that it would spread if we didn't act quickly. The officer called for reinforcements and ordered us to make a swift attack to prevent the fire from spreading. Cutting off its path so it wouldn't continue to grow was an important first step. Lionel and I ran to the back to grab hoses, while Captain Gutierrez started shouting orders after assessing the situation. While we were doing this, in the darkness of the road, I heard a woman's voice shouting something, though I couldn't make out exactly what. The sound of the flames in the breeze was very loud, and yet I heard her, and a quick glance to my left at Lionel was enough to tell me he had heard her too. There were no houses or buildings of any kind nearby, so it was very strange to hear someone there. The person who made the call was a driver passing through the area. I headed towards the edge of the ravine, and about 60 meters down the slope was the woman I had seen, or at least I think I had, since she was dressed in black with similar clothing, a black veil, and a dress. And although the light from the nearby flames allowed me to make her out, she seemed to be talking to someone else, but there was no way to see them because of the smoke and darkness. I immediately raised the alarm, as the situation had completely changed. It was no longer just about containing a fire. Now we had to rescue this woman who, inexplicably, had gotten herself into the middle of the flames and was now having a heated conversation with someone we couldn't see, so there were probably at least 2 victims. Officer Gutierrez and Sergeant Martinez ran in our direction and saw the same thing I did. The priority changed completely, and now we had to rescue this woman. We tried to communicate with her, but it was impossible. She didn't seem to be paying attention to us and remained engrossed in a conversation with someone else. At that moment, Lionel and I were left in charge of Sergeant Martinez, and the plan was as follows: take 2 oxygen tanks and descend connected to lifelines. Lionel would stay at the top while Martinez and I descended to the woman. Once there, we would put a harness on her and carry her to the top as quickly as possible. We prepared as quickly as we could and slowly began our descent. While Lionel continued trying to communicate with the woman, Sergeant Martinez and I carefully descended the slope, taking care not to fall on the rocks and trying to establish a path to return by once we reached the victim. Despite the thick smoke and the color of her clothes, we could still make out her silhouette amidst the flames. For me, Martinez, it was like stepping into an oven, and I didn't understand how. After so many minutes, that woman was still standing there screaming. Yes, now I could hear her voice clearly, and she was shouting at someone, but I couldn't quite make out the conversation. It was surprising, since with all that smoke, she probably couldn't be breathing properly. We shouted again, trying to get her to walk toward us, but she didn't hear us until we were about 30 meters away. We had come a long way through that inferno, and yet she hadn't reacted until then. She turned around when we called, and through the smoke and fire, I could see After an exhaustive search, we were running out of oxygen in our tanks and had to prioritize our safety. We left the charred body undisturbed, as it had become a potential crime scene and we shouldn't disturb any possible evidence. Instead, we returned following the lifelines, and once we were out of the fire, we went back to work as there was still a fire to contain. Other trucks had already arrived, and the fire had spread considerably, so we didn't have time to dwell on it. Woman in her 80s, very frail. I raised my hand, signaling to her, though I assumed that, given her condition and age, the woman must be either unconscious or at least hallucinating from carbon monoxide poisoning. Sergeant Martinez yelled that we were from the fire department and that she shouldn't move. We were relieved to see she was okay, but what happened next was simply unbelievable. We were no more than 20 meters away, surrounded by burnt vegetation and rocks. Burning hot, we saw her raise her hand, returning our salute. I couldn't quite make out the details of her face, but I'm almost certain she didn't smile for a second before curling up in a fetal position on the ground. We tried to quicken our pace, thinking she'd reached her limit. But 3 seconds after she sat down, a black bird flew out from the exact spot where she did. I'm not sure if it was a vulture or maybe a crow. I don't know much about birds, and besides, the smoke in the air made it very difficult to see. Sergeant Martinez grabbed my arm and told me to wait, then shouted a couple more times. But she didn't answer. We continued walking, although I noticed a certain hesitation in her gait from that moment on, while Lionel radioed us saying we shouldn't be far now, but that he had lost sight of the victim. When we arrived at the site, we didn't find her, but we did stumble upon a grim discovery. A charred body lay nearby, close to where we had seen the woman. We radioed our find and continued searching for the woman whom not only I, but also Captain Gutierrez, Lionel, and Sergeant Martinez had seen. We looked everywhere, even a little further down the slope, calling out to her, but we couldn't find her. And then a chill ran down my spine as I thought about the bird I saw fly away seconds after she disappeared. I already told you I don't believe in these things. But what if it was her? I didn't have time to dwell on it, since we had just survived. We managed to contain the fire around 6 a.m., and it was no wonder we were all exhausted. But when we were finally able to sit down and relax a little, the inevitable memory of that old woman returned to my mind. Lionel was beside me and must have guessed my intentions, because he suddenly said, "That woman disappeared without explanation, and how did she manage to get there before us?" At that moment, I realized that he had also seen her on the road. I told him I didn't think they were the same person, but then he suddenly started thinking and said with some certainty, "I think she was a witch." Sergeant Martinez was nearby, and I thought he would reprimand us for talking about supernatural things, but contrary to what I expected, he agreed with Lionel. Not so much that he confirmed she was a witch, but he did admit that the whole thing was very strange. The captain arrived and we agreed that the report included that mysterious woman, now missing, was there. We speculated that the body in the ravine might be her, but we soon discovered, thanks to the forensic experts who arrived shortly after, that the body belonged to an unknown adult male. The fire was started, but other than that, we never heard anything more about the case. Even today, I wonder how that woman managed to escape and who she was talking to, and I can't find an explanation. Lionel didn't see any birds fly out of the smoke, but his vision was so limited that it's quite possible he didn't notice. However, the sergeant can attest to what I saw, and I know that the woman suddenly crouched down, and then a bird flew out. A short time later, word spread through the station, and everyone started talking about how strange that night had been. They were all direct witnesses to something supernatural, but some colleagues heard whispers, laughter, and saw shadows moving around. I would normally attribute it to the noise of the flames and the confusion caused by the smoke and the pressure of the job, but the truth is, we're all professionals, and we couldn't have imagined everything we saw. I suppose that, years later, I have to admit that perhaps there are things that have no explanation, and that on that summer night, I witnessed evil people with a power that defies all logic. My name is Martin, and I'm a bus driver for a long-distance route that connects Guatemala City to the highlands. For 20 years, I have navigated these winding mountain roads, carrying people home to their villages, to markets, and to family. I know every curve, every pothole, and every stretch where the fog settles thick as cotton wool. But there is one trip from the rainy season of 2015 that I have never been able to explain, no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind. It was a Thursday, and the afternoon rain had been relentless, turning the asphalt into a dark, shining ribbon and swelling the rivers that crashed through the gorges below. My bus was the last scheduled departure, and the conditions meant only a handful of brave, desperate souls were aboard. An elderly campesino with his woven bags, a young mother with a sleeping infant, two tired-looking students, and a man in a dark suit who kept to himself at the back. The final passenger was a woman I had not seen before. She boarded at the very edge of the city, where the streetlights grow sparse. She was dressed in traditional traje, but it was of a style and color I did not recognize, deep indigo with intricate somber purple patterns. She paid her fare with exact change, her eyes downcast, and took a seat directly behind me, near the front door. We set off into the gloom. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the downpour. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the rain and the occasional faint glow from a lone farmhouse far up the slopes. The atmosphere inside the bus was silent, heavy with the sound of the engine and the weather. I checked my mirrors out of habit. The woman in the indigo traje was perfectly still, staring straight ahead, not out the window at the storm, but at the empty road ahead, as if she could see something I could not. About an hour into the journey, as we began a steep ascent into a particularly dense patch of cloud forest, she spoke. Her voice was clear and low, cutting through the noise. "You must not stop," she said. "No matter what you see on the road, you must not stop this bus until you reach the crest." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking directly at me now, her expression severe. I gave a curt nod, assuming she was just anxious about the road conditions. Passengers often get nervous on this stretch. The fog grew denser, until my headlights reflected back at me, creating a swirling white wall. I slowed to a crawl, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, just at the edge of my light. It was a man, or something shaped like a man, but his posture was all wrong, bent and twisted. He held out a hand as if flagging us down. A cold dread, sharper than any normal fear of an accident, seized my chest. I remembered the woman's words. I tightened my grip and maintained my slow, steady speed, aiming directly for the spot where the figure stood. The students in the middle of the bus gasped. The man in the suit stood up. "Stop! There's someone there!" he shouted. "Sit down!" I commanded, my voice louder than I intended. I did not break. As we drew nearer, the figure's details became clearer under the lights. Its clothes were ragged and caked with dried mud. Its face was not a face, but a smooth, featureless plane, like wet clay. It did not move out of the way. I closed my eyes for a half second, expecting an impact that never came. There was only a sudden, intense chill that washed through the bus as if we had driven through a freezer. The baby began to wail. When I looked in the mirror again, the road behind us was empty. The woman behind me let out a long, slow breath. "Good," she murmured. "Now you must not open the doors, not for any reason, not until we are in the plaza of the next town." The passengers were in a quiet uproar. The man in the suit was demanding an explanation. The students were whispering frantically. The old campesino merely made the sign of the cross and stared fixedly at his feet. I focused on the road, my heart hammering against my ribs. The woman's instructions were not a request. They felt like the only rules keeping us safe. 10 minutes later, we approached a small, dilapidated bus shelter, a known stop for a cluster of homes up a footpath. A group of 3 people stood under its tin roof, waving for the bus to stop. As we drew closer, I could see them clearly. A woman and 2 children. Their clothes were soaked, and they looked desperate. The young mother on my bus cried out, "Stop! You have to stop for them! They'll freeze!" Every instinct in my body, every rule of my job screamed at me to halt and help. My foot hovered over the brake. "Do not open the doors." The words from the woman behind me were like stones dropped into the silence. I looked at the people in the shelter. The woman was waving, but her face was oddly blank. The 2 children beside her were perfectly still, their eyes wide and unblinking. They did not shiver. They did not move their feet. They simply stared at the bus as we passed. In that moment, I saw that the puddles at their feet were not rippling from the rain. It was as if the rain was passing through them. I pressed the accelerator. and we left them behind in the gloom. A profound silence, broken only by the infant's soft cries, filled the bus. The final leg of the climb was a torment. Shapes flitted at the edges of my vision in the forest. Pale lights like will-o'-the-wisps danced between the trees, keeping pace with us. I felt a pressure, a palpable malevolence pushing against the bus, as if the very fog wanted to swallow us whole. The woman in indigo began to speak softly, not in Spanish, but in a language I did not understand, a rhythmic chanting cadence that seemed to hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road leveled out. The fog thinned, and ahead I saw the warm, welcoming lights of the town plaza, the church, the municipal building, the little shops. I drove straight into the center and brought the bus to a halt in front of the well-lit parquet. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the woman stood. She walked to the front, placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. Her touch was ice cold. "You did well. This is a safe place. You can let them off now." Then, she walked down the steps. I opened the doors, but by the time I looked out to see where she had gone, she had vanished into the shadow between two buildings. The passengers disembarked in a daze, the man in the suit muttering about reporting me, the young mother clutching her child and weeping with relief. The old campesino approached me as I checked the tires, more out of habit than necessity. He looked at me with ancient, knowing eyes. "You had a guardiana tonight, senor," he said quietly. "The roads in that pass are not just roads when the rain is this heavy. They are borders. She was seeing you across." He tipped his hat and walked away. I never saw the woman in the indigo traje again. I asked in the villages along my route, describing her distinctive clothing. An elder in one town just shook his head. "Indigo and purple? That is not for the living. That is for those who guide the living through the dangerous places." I still drive that route, but I'm extra cautious on rainy Thursday nights. And I have a new, unbreakable rule for myself, born of that journey. Some passengers are not just traveling from one place to another. Some are ensuring the bus completes its journey at all.